Hi. Thanks very much to the organizers for putting together such a great workshop at a very strange and uncertain time. I'm really happy to be with you all virtually. Now, I'd like you to imagine in the not so distant, hopefully post-coronavirus future, that you're working on campus with this friendly autonomous robot. You manage to get separated and need to coordinate on a place to meet up. What do you do? Well, one option is to guess a likely or salient location that you expect will also be salient to your partner, like this particularly large building where you may have met up before. So this is often called a focal points or a Schelling points, and is basically the best you can do without explicit communication. However, if you're allowed to communicate, a second option is just to call up your partner and try to describe that same place in a way that they're likely to understand using language. So in addition to shared expectations about which buildings are salient candidates to be described, this strategy also relies on shared expectations about the meanings of words in language, which can still be noisy and misunderstood. So if you say, meet me in the light-colored modernist building with breezeway near a busy road on the north side of campus, your partner could have a different sense of what modernism is, or think you were referring to a different busy road, or so forth. Now, finally, if you happen to be in a really familiar place where both you and your partner have spent a lot of time before, you may both know specialized names to refer to each building, like Jacobs Hall, which essentially guarantees much more efficient and robust coordination. So this example is specifically about a spatial coordination problem, but it turns out that many settings in which humans and robots need to collaborate, or any autonomous agents want to collaborate, can be recast as coordination problems with the same basic structure. And all three of these strategies that I've described rely to varying degrees on what we call conventional expectations. There have been many different attempts to define the idea of a social convention, but one of the earliest and most influential is from the philosopher David Lewis. According to Lewis, conventions are arbitrary but stable solutions to recurring coordination problems. They're arbitrary because there are many other equally good solutions. It doesn't matter which building you meet up at or what name you want to call that building, as long as you and your partner share the same expectations. And they're stable because once they're established, there's no incentive to deviate from them. There's no reason to suddenly start calling the building by a different name. So it's clear that when conventions exist, according to the Lewis sense of convention, they're extremely powerful tools for solving coordination problems and navigating our social world. A long-standing puzzle has been what you and your friend should do in a novel environment where you don't already have strong conventions, where you don't know the names of buildings or have any prior history. How do efficient and accurate conventions emerge in this new environment? And to what extent are these possibly related to other background knowledge that you may have had in other environments? So this is the central question that I've tried to approach in my research. And I think in some ways it's one of the most fundamental questions we can ask about emergent phenomena in general, since conventions are by definition not under the control of any single agent. They're a property of groups. But in this talk, I'll split this problem into two parts. First, because my primary goal as a cognitive scientist is to provide a theory of what individual minds, whether they're human minds or machine minds, are doing or can do explicitly to solve this problem, we first need an account of how people establish conventions with individual partners in a dyadic setting, which is the actual first-person experience of an agent. Then we will try to generalize that account to understand how conventions actually can emerge at the population level. Okay, so that's the big picture, but to make this a little more concrete, I'm going to focus in this talk on a particularly ubiquitous kind of coordination problem, which is communication, trying to use language to convey particular ideas or meanings to other agents. And I specifically use a paradigm called a reference game, which I've found to be a good fruit fly for studying communication and coordination. In this paradigm, we pair up a speaker and a listener, often two humans recruited on the internet, but sometimes a human and a machine or two machines. And you assign one of them to a speaker role and the other to a listener role. You present them both a set of objects. In this case, these fairly abstract tangram objects that are purposefully ambiguous, that people don't already have strong conventions for. And you ask the speaker to produce a description for the highlighted target object such that their partner can pick that object out of the context. So they can type whatever they want into the chat box, which their partner then sees, often has the opportunity to write something back or reply by asking questions, and then eventually makes a selection. Finally, both people get feedback about which target was the correct answer and what their partner picked, and then they advance to the next trial. Now, critically, this goes on long enough so each target appears multiple times, and we can see how the language people use changes as they accumulate shared history with their partner and are able to coordinate on ways of referring to these objects that are more easily understandable. Now, what makes this paradigm ideal for studying communication and coordination is that I think it strikes this great balance of being controlled, where it's clear what the objective is, but at the same time open-ended so that people can say whatever they want and elicit fairly rich natural language. So there's a classical model of how people perform this task that goes back to Shannon at Bell Labs, which essentially assumes that both people share the same encoder and decoder function, here represented by the function f. So essentially, if I, the speaker, have something in my mind, a particular target object, I just have to encode that into a durable signal that can pass in the material world, which then just has to be decoded into that idea, possibly noisily, in my partner's head. So this has been a really powerful approach, but we've argued instead for an adaptive view where we don't exactly know what F is in our partner's head. This is unfortunately the situation that that we're much more frequently in, given that we each have unique histories, and a lot of the things we're trying to talk about don't have sort of hard-coded ways of talking about them. Instead, we represent this with a parameterized function, giving our current best guess about how our partner is likely to interpret our words. And after we get feedback on our partner's behavior, in this case, on their language use, we can update or tweak our representation to be more accurate, like so. Our proposed computational model of semantic adaptation integrates 3 core cognitive mechanisms, and we'll walk through them one by one. First, we need to formalize the idea that people account for the variability of meanings in the population with some uncertainty over what a particular partner thinks our signals will mean. In other words, they have to bring some background expectations into an interaction. Second, after we've gotten some evidence from a partner, we need a mechanism allowing us to quickly update our expectations about what that particular partner means. And finally, we need some mechanism specifying how the evidence we've gotten from one partner is expected to generalize to others in the population. Okay. So to see how this first mechanism works, it helps to provide a concrete definition of a speaker S. We assume a Bayesian theory of a speaker, which attempts to select an utterance U on the left side to communicate the identity of an object O by reasoning about how the listener will understand them. And in the classical version of this model, the listener is assumed to choose objects proportional to their literal meanings according to this fixed semantics, F, which is assumed to be the same as the speaker's. So to relax this, we were inspired by the idea of lexical uncertainty or semantic uncertainty recently proposed by Leon Bergen in the linguistics literature, which essentially parameterizes the function that the listener is expected to be using. The speaker then has a prior over the identity of this function given by p theta and attempts to choose utterances that are good on average, marginalizing over this uncertainty. I think that it's also worth noting here that there's nothing particularly special about this linguistic setup of a speaker and a listener. And I think you can fairly straightforwardly see how this function F could instead represent a behavioral policy in a Markov decision process or some other property of the agent that you're trying to coordinate with. The point is that this is an inferential problem about a property of another agent that you need to learn about in order to successfully interact with them. Okay, so now we have a speaker with some prior beliefs about what words mean to their partner, which they've acquired from their previous life experience. How do they begin to form new conventions with a new partner? Well, the key idea in this Bayesian framework is that we can take our prior over theta and take into account new observations, new data about a partner's language use to obtain a updated posterior distribution. Then essentially, all the speaker has to do is interact with its partner using this new updated best guess. And we do this belief updating according to Bayes' rule. Essentially, we have a generative model of how the listener would act under different underlying semantic functions, and we can upweight thetas that are consistent with their behavior and downweight thetas that are inconsistent. Third, this same Bayesian framework actually gives a very natural way of generalizing to new partners through hierarchical inference, but we'll return to how that third mechanism works in the second part of the talk. So this formalization as a probabilistic model has a number of very elegant theoretical properties for convention formation, which we can demonstrate through various simulations. But there's a problem, which is that the full-blown Bayesian approach doesn't scale very well beyond a few objects and words. This inference is very expensive. So what can we do to scale this up to have a model of agents that can produce and understand natural language in all of its high dimensional complexity? Well, an exciting recent result is that this same hierarchical framework, this hierarchical Bayesian framework, can be approximated by deep neural network models that can fine-tune via gradient descent on real-world language tasks. So we built an image captioning network that takes in photos like this cat and outputs a distribution over multi-word captions or utterances that are true of that image. So this is a pre-trained model on a data set like COCO. And we can take this fixed pre-trained version of the model, as long as it produces some reasonable initial captions, and equip it with a mechanism to adapt to the task of communicating with a particular partner. So essentially on each time step, we take some small number of gradient steps, essentially trying to approximate the theta that our partner is using. And here, theta is a point in parameter space, and we're trying to move toward it using data from that partner. Okay. So to test how well our system interacts with and understands real people and adapts in real time, we designed a repeated reference game task using natural images and context with very similar images that were designed to be particularly challenging for our model. So every time a person provides a description, our model was a listener in this particular example, it's probably one it's never seen in training. So it has to identify which image is the best match under its initial pre-trained captioning model, which is not particularly good. So round trip, it takes about 6 seconds to update its beliefs and come back with a response in this update step before advancing to the next round. But after extended interactions, it gradually changes the model that it's using to adapt, and we hope that this helps communicate more efficiently as it can form these conventions. Okay, so to give you a feel for the data, here's an example game with a human speaker in this particular context of images, which all kind of contain glass windows. So as you can see, the speaker the human speaker begins with these fairly long-winded descriptions, and the model is not particularly accurate, as represented by these. So the red utterances were ones where the model chose incorrectly, and the green ones are correct. But you can see that this particular speaker converged to these fairly short conventional labels for all of these images. Okay. So while we can do this for lots of different games, about 120 games in total, look at the listener accuracy across repetitions. So as it sees the same images multiple times, how does it improve its performance? So we see that this captioning model is initially barely above chance due to the challenging context, but it quickly improved its performance nearly up to human levels. Additionally, we saw that a non-adapting baseline model that continues using its initial captioning, pre-trained captioning model doesn't improve. So this increase in accuracy seen in the adaptive model cannot be attributed purely to the human adapting to the model. It seems like the model adapting is really what is driving this dramatic improvement in performance. We can also look at the improvements in efficiency, looking at the human speaker's utterance length and whether they're able to converge on utterances that are not only more reliable in getting our model to choose the correct answer, but also more efficient to produce. And we see that although it's not as good as when interacting with other humans, as soon as our model stops making mistakes, which strongly indicate that it's not understanding at the very beginning of the interaction, humans are comfortable at decreasing the length of their utterances significantly. So in this section, I presented a formal model integrating 3 cognitive mechanisms. An initial semantic uncertainty that represents some initialization in your beliefs about your partner's meanings, what's in your partner's head, along with a mechanism for partner-specific learning and generalization. And we showed that this model can be scaled up to neural language models that can adapt to human partners in real time. Next, for the rest of the talk, we'll turn to examining the emergent group phenomena that can arise from this cognitive model of adaptation. And it helps to see this kind of emergent property as a bit of an inductive puzzle, kind of coming from this inductive puzzle, which is that conventions are definitionally defined to hold over entire communities, which is what makes them useful. It's what allows us to generalize to people we've never met before and contexts we've never been in before. You don't have to relearn language from scratch when you're asking a new barista for a drink. But we only have direct experience with a small subset of the billions of people on the earth and those that speak our language. So how do we make this inductive leap? So this is a slightly updated version of, okay. How do we go from this picture on the left, where we have beliefs about a particular partner, to this picture on the right, where we have beliefs about a community as a whole? So this is a slightly updated version of a very old problem about how conventions spread through communities, or how we all manage to reach consensus. And it's a very old question that we can help to put our model in context by first discussing some popular previous ways of answering it. So one very simple solution that goes back to the mid-90s is that conventions basically spread like diseases. So suppose you have a big community represented as a social network where each node is an individual and each edge means these individuals come into contact. And you can run these simulations where you randomly pair up agents and have them play something like our reference games. So say at time t equals 1, you take a particular node and pair them with one of their partners, who happens to be node 32. The partner uses utterance A to describe the objects which our node stores in their memory, and then at the next time step, they're paired with a different partner who might use B. They store that in their memory, and so on with all of their different neighbors. So these models then have that agent in the future produce some utterance that's a function of the previous experience that they have in their memory. For instance, via a majority vote rule, where they would start producing A because most of the people they've interacted with previously produced A. So we call these complete pooling models because essentially all of the data that they've seen from different partners gets pooled together into a single undifferentiated memory bank. And I should say that while this is a cartoon according to modern standards, this idea of complete pooling also applies to more sophisticated approaches. So recent work in the emergent communication literature often uses much more sophisticated reinforcement learning approaches, training end-to-end with image inputs and multi-word utterances, but fundamentally the policy that's being updated doesn't differentiate between different partners or different contexts. It gets paired up with lots of different agents and updates the same monolithic model. Okay, so this really simple model from the 90s actually solves this induction problem with no problems at all. It allows the emergence of shared expectations. So on the left side is the internal languages that different agents were initialized with in a large population. And if you run this kind of simulation forward for 100 epochs, you get something like this. And if you run it longer, it often converges to a single language. So this works essentially because it's ignoring the fact that there's a difference between individual partners and an entire community. It's treating every partner as a sample from a community. But this has a problem. So some conventions might work this way, like when we encounter anonymous drivers on different sides of the road. But most of our interactions aren't these sort of one-shot cases with random people. We interact with the same partner repeatedly, and we know who they are. We have social identity information about them. So this is real data from the a study done by Dino Wilkes-Gibbs and Herb Clark in the early 90s, where they had partners swap after a few rounds of interaction. And what you see is that while a complete pooling model predicts that basically who you're talking to shouldn't matter, people actually care about this a lot. So they don't want to extend conventions that were formed with one partner to a totally different partner. So this is a kind of generalization gradients that we would like our models to be able to capture, because there's good reasons for this. So you can think of very simple ways of solving this, like indexing memory to a partner, essentially learning a different model for every person you talk to. But the problem with this is that it can't generalize at all. It doesn't know how to extend these experiences to a new partner. So these are called no pooling models, but they sort of have the inverse problem. You can never get a new convention off the ground. So the hierarchical Bayesian model that we presented is essentially a compromise between these two endpoints, and is often called in statistical literature a partial pooling model. And as has been understood for a long time in the meta-learning literature, this is a really powerful way of having a principled way of generalizing from one domain to another, where we think of partners as domains. So essentially, if you assume that the entire population shares this big theta, you can do a sharing of statistical strength from one partner to another. So just wrapping up in my last few minutes here, we wanted to test this model empirically. So we designed a round robin repeated reference game with small networks of human speakers. So we paired up humans with one partner for 16 trials of a reference game. Then they swapped partners and did the same targets with a different partner, and then finally with a third partner. So by the end of the tournament, everyone had interacted repeatedly with every other neighbor. And here are our simulation results from our partial pooling model compared with these alternative complete pooling and no pooling models. And we see these signature patterns of reversion at partner boundaries, but overall upward generalization that support the partial pooling model and are inconsistent with the other two models. So this is true for listener accuracy and speaker efficiency. So speakers use fewer words over time, increase the number of words when they encounter a new partner, essentially reverting to their prior, but gradually are more and more willing to extend new conventions to new partners as they go. And finally, we were interested in the overall network convergence, because different partners start using different ways of describing these objects, and we can look at the linguistic alignment between dyads that aren't currently interacting on a network. So this is basically a measure of whether everyone is converged on the same conventions. And what we see again is that our empirical data, people maintain highly aligned with their current partner, but over the course of interaction, they become the entire network as a whole converges in the way that's predicted by this partial pooling model. So this is a kind of emergent shared convention That's not a property of any individual agent. Okay. So in this section, we took a particular aspect of that original model, the hierarchical inference mechanism that implements a sort of meta-learning theory of how we treat different partners as distinct tasks, but are trying to abstract away the good initializations across different partners over time. And I think importantly for the study of conventions and of emergent behavior, this task-specific learning or partner-specific learning is not only compatible with network-wide conventions and network-wide consensus, but may actually facilitate it via statistical mechanisms like the blessing of abstraction. Okay. So just to wrap up, I just wanted to give a bit of a shout out of some other things that we've learned about conventions in this line of research. So for one thing, conventions are modality general. So it doesn't matter whether you're using verbal language, written language, or drawings, the same kind of adaptation appears to explain behavior. Second, in a kind of behavioral coordination paradigm akin to classic game theory coordination games, we can compare the kinds of conventions that emerge in both real-time environments where instead of making simultaneous decisions, agents are avatars that have real-time control and manipulate the stakes of the interaction. And we find that conventions are more likely to emerge in high-stakes interactions, whereas in low-stakes real-time interactions, agents can often handle things by nudging one another easily on the fly. So they don't need to form strong sort of generalizable expectations because they can just work things out dynamically. And finally, the conventions that form are importantly sensitive to context. So if you play different reference games where different kinds of distinctions are relevant, people will converge on very different systems of conventions that are appropriate for making those distinctions. So these are three ways in which conventions are functionally important for navigating our social worlds. And thank you very much for your attention.